In previous weeks, we've been looking at Greek and Roman tragedy, but now we want to turn our attention to the contrasting genre. We want to think a little bit about Greek and Roman comedy. You may remember that for tragedy, our guide was Aristotle's Poetics, a book that had two large parts, one about dramatic poetry and one about comedic poetry. But the second part is by and large lost. We have a few brief statements about comedy, including a statement that comedy's origins, in contrast to tragedy, which developed from the dithyramb, comedy developed from the phallic processions at festivals to honor Dionysus, sort of the opening and bawdy ceremonies that would kick off a Dionysian festival. But most of what Aristotle would tell us about Poetics was in that second book that we no longer have a copy of. For that reason, we don't have the same kind of firm definition about comedy from Aristotle that we have about tragedy. But that doesn't mean that we can't do some heavy thinking and maybe deduce a definition from his definition of tragedy, thinking about what we know about comedy as a kind of contrasting form, a different genre, thinking about what we know about comedy in the time, and thinking about the way he defined tragedy that might leave room for those contrasts. So let's just do a quick reminder for ourselves about how he defined tragedy. He said tragedy is a story about human experience that is treated seriously, is complete, and is about an important topic which we have discussed, is agency. What causes things to happen, the things that happen to happen. That it is expressed in heightened language using mimesis, that is acted out, and purifying through pity and fear, catharsis. Now, when we think about those definitions, we might be able to figure out the points of contrast. But comedy is not a complete opposite. Not everything is different about comedy. Comedy is still a story about human experience, but instead of being treated seriously, it's treated humorously. It's still complete, and it's still about an important topic. We'll come back to that in a second. It's expressed, rather than in heightened language, in funny or crude language. It still uses mimesis, and it still purifies, but rather through pity and terror. Comedy purifies through pleasure and laughter. So, what stays the same in that definition? That's the part that's really interesting to us. Both comedy and tragedy are stories about human experience, as opposed to stories about specific humans. Both comedy and tragedy are complete. That is, they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Both comedy and tragedy use mimesis instead of diegesis. They are acted out instead of narrated to us. But it's the third one of these that we really want to spend the most time on because it's the one that surprises us the most. Both comedy and tragedy are about something important. Tragedy is about agency. Comedy tends to be about society. That is, in tragedy we're worrying about what causes things to happen, what causes those things to happen, which is in some sense a discussion about the relation of man to the divine. Is there some kind of cosmic force in the universe that orders our lives, our fates? Comedy is also about something important, but rather than man's relationship to the divine, comedy tends to be about man's relationship to society. How do men relate to each other? Now, that's still an important topic. If we think about both of those forms and their trivial topics, Then on the tragedy side, when that serious treatment starts being applied to something that isn't important, then we get what we now think of as sort of melodramas, action movies, that kind of thing, where it's supposed to be important somehow, but we know it's not because the hero can't be killed even if somebody shoots, 10 people with machine guns shooting at them and somehow all of them miss. And one person by themselves can stop the invading force of aliens from taking over our universe, something like that, where it's all treated very seriously, but when we think about it, it's so unreal that it's not really important. On the comedy side, we have a humorous treatment, but when nothing is important, then we have a farce. Then we have dash and door slam, people hiding from each other and running around and making silly sounds, the kinds of things that go on in movies like The Hangover or the girl movies, Bridesmaids, those kinds of things, where everything is very funny, but it's not really about anything deep or important. But we want to adhere to this idea that both ancient comedy and ancient tragedy were about something important. Their treatment differs, serious to humorous, but not their content. Right? So what stays the same? Both comedy and tragedy are stories of human experience that are complete, that are about something important, and that use mimesis. What changes? The treatment of the serious subject matter is humorous. That is, there's underneath a very serious content, but we can look at it with a humorous eye. We can think about what's funny about it and what's serious about it. And rather than using heightened language, poetry, metaphor, we can start using funny language, even crude language, obscenities. We can start using language that achieves some of that humor. And we can still think about comedy as being a purifying experience, that we come in with certain kinds of burdens and we are purified of those emotions. But in this case, rather than pity and terror scaring them out of us, pleasure and laughter release them from us. Right? So, thinking about Aristotle's definitions, we might be able to think about some broad patterns. Tragedy tends to be a form that focuses on the fate of a specific individual. In the course of tragedies, oftentimes more and more people die and the stage gets more and more empty till we get finally down to the hero, the protagonist, standing on stage alone, facing their fate. Comedy tends to work in exactly the opposite way. Comedy tends to pile more and more people on stage until we get to a final scene where all of society is together and all of society is celebrating. Tragedy is often achieved through stories about fate and even about protagonists in monologue, in soliloquy, contemplating their fate. In comedy, we don't have so much trouble knowing why the things that are happening, so there's not so much need for contemplation. In comedy, things are happening because somebody is intriguing. Somebody is running around, planning, plotting, trying to get things happening, usually a funny or clever instigator who's trying to trick other people. Because we know what's causing it all to happen, there's not so much monologue as much as there is an abundance of plot, a lot of intrigue. We don't have that much trouble telling tragedy and comedy apart, right? They're really different forms, and in certain ways they're opposites. But we just want to think about the broad patterns that power them forward. when we think about classical comedians, in the same way that we're thinking about a very limited number of tragedians, we're really only talking about 4 comedians from the classical period that we have a substantial body of work or think about in a substantial way. The oldest of those is Aristophanes, who wrote Greek Old Comedy, but even Aristophanes was writing contemporaneously with Sophocles and Euripides, but he outlived them and continued to write them, so we think of him as 1 generation later than Sophocles and Aristophanes. And that's really the oldest comedy that we have. Then we know about a style of comedy called Greek New Comedy. The great exemplar of Greek New Comedy is Menander. Menander wrote a number of plays which were eventually copied by the Romans, particularly Plautus, who wrote early Roman comedy. Plautus was writing only 50 years after Aristotle lived, who we think of as at the height of the Greeks. Plautus was very, very early. He not only was the earliest Roman theater figure, he's really the earliest figure of Roman literature overall. And he's as far away from Julius Caesar as we are, say, from George Washington. He was very, very early. Later than him is the playwright Terence, but we only have these 4 figures to really think about in the comedic tradition. And in the same way in tragedy, we're thinking about a very limited canon. There's quite a limited number of plays for us to think about on the comedy side. We only have 11 complete plays by Aristophanes, and shockingly, because we know of 80 plays by Menander that we even have fragments of. We know titles of 120, but we have small pieces of 80 plays. But we really only have 1 complete play by Menander. And even that was not found in a complete form until 1957, relatively recently. We have 20 plays by Plautus, and we have 6 plays by Terence. That is, we see the loss of plays from the classical period on the comedy side as well as on the tragedy side. Terence died very young and may not have written any more than 6 plays. All of his plays may have become famous and moved forward. Plautus, though, this is a tiny part of his output. Menander, a minute part of his output. Aristophanes, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/10 of his plays. We don't know how many he wrote overall, but certainly many, many more than the 11 that we have. So, we're going to look at this in the course of this chapter. We'll think about 1 play by Aristophanes, The Frogs, in much greater detail. We'll look at 1 play by Plautus, Pseudolus, in much greater detail. And of course, we'll look into the biography and the complete canon of all these playwrights in greater detail in additional videos.